Hey everybody, thanks for joining us. We're going to give everyone just a minute to get online real quick. A few more people, so we've got 11 so far. All right, I think that's everybody for now. I'll just keep on watching the waiting room. If anybody knows of anyone that's having trouble getting in, just have them email me or a message on Facebook or something, and I'll help them out. So I'm Jackie with Hub City Bookshop, and I'm here with Julia Koets and Scott Gould. And we're going to be talking about Julia's new book of poetry, Pine. And Scott Gould also has a new book out called Things That Crash, Things That Fly that we're excited about. So I'm going to introduce Scott and then let him take it from there, introducing Julia and getting our conversation started. If you have any questions, just plug them into the chat window and I'll take those towards the end of the conversation. And you can also just say which author it's for, if it's for someone in particular, and I'll make sure that gets to the right person, okay? Thanks again for being here, and we're really excited about this conversation. So Scott Gould was born, raised, and still lives in South Carolina. His first book, Strangers to Temptation, a linked story collection the Atlanta Journal-Constitution called a compulsive read, was published by Hub City Press in 2017. Whereabouts, his debut novel, published by Kohler Books, is available, just came out in October 2020. His memoir, Things That Crash, Things That Fly, just published this March. And his next novel, The Hammerhead Chronicles, will be published by the University of North Georgia Press in June of this year. His fiction and nonfiction have appeared in Kenyon Review, New Stories from the South, Black Warrior Review, Carolina Quarterly, Pithead Chapel, Garden and Gun, New Ohio Review, Crazy Horse, and The Bitter Southerner, among others. He is a two-time winner of the South Carolina Arts Commission's Individual Artist Fellowship in Prose and the South Carolina Academy of Authors Fiction Fellowship. He lives in Sans Souci, South Carolina, with a cat and a dog, and teaches creative writing at South Carolina Governor's School for the Arts and Humanities. He's still pulling for the breaks, and he's here with us from South Carolina. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jackie, and thanks Hub City for this. It's nice to see folks out there. I see some writers out there and some old friends, and but this tonight is about my friend Julia. Let me just give you some of the formal introduction, and I'll tell you. Julia, in 2011, she won the South Carolina Poetry Book Prize that was judged by Nikki Finney for a book called Whole Like Owls, which is a fantastic book of poems. And in 2017, she won the 2017, like I said, Red Hen Prize Nonfiction Book Award, judged by Mark Doty. And then this new book of hers, Pine, won the Michael Waters Poetry Prize. So I guess the thing to learn from this is, if you're thinking of entering a contest and Julia's in it, don't waste your time, because she wins contests and gets these beautiful books out of it. Julia now teaches at University of South Florida, and but that's the details. I've known Julia for a long time. Back in 2002, we kind of pinpointed the date. She was a student at Presbyterian College, and I was teaching creative writing there, a night class. And there were about 95% of the people in that class couldn't care less about creative writing. And the other 5% was Julia, who was sitting in the front row, and really just, you could tell, when you're a teacher and you have somebody sitting there nodding and soaking things up, it makes you feel good about what you're saying. And she was writing wonderful things, and I was so happy that later on I found out she went and did an MFA, and then we had Julia come and teach at the summer program at the Governor's School for one summer, and she did a great job with our students there. But anyway, I would just like to formally welcome your featured poet for the night, Julia Koets.
Thank you so much, Scott. Yeah, it's really great to be here. Thank you, Jackie, for hosting this event and Hub City. It's really nice to be here. And yeah, so Scott, I took creative writing with him in college. He kind of encouraged me to go after the MFA. And so he's been a mentor of mine for a long time. So thanks so much, Scott.
Yeah. Well, when I was sending my manuscript to the Red Hen Prize and you won, see, that whole mentor thing just went out the window. So no, listen, let's talk about these poems, and I'm gonna ask you a few things, and then we're gonna hear you read some. But one thing is that I'm just, when I read a collection that's this wonderfully put together, I always wonder, how does that, what does that work? Do you start writing poems and then you suddenly say, oh, there's a through line here and I see what I can do with these? Or do you start out going, I'm going to write a poem, I'm going to write poems under this umbrella? What chicken and egg, I guess, is what comes first?
Yeah, for me, I'm just like writing poems to start with, and I'm not thinking about one thing in particular, sort of like, oh, this is where I'm seeing things, or I want to write poems about this particular subject or this theme. And so maybe I write, I don't know, 40 to 60 poems. And of course, during that time, I kind of realized there's some like series of poems in the book. So like ones that there's multiple poems in. And so, of course, those feel connected already just through the fact that they're in part of a series. But I'm not really thinking too much about through lines and like theme until I actually then sit down with all the poems, put them out on like the table. Usually we have a big like dining room table. And I have like a couple friends. I was like, tell me like, what are some of your favorite poems? I want to have like, them spread out. Another thing that when I was putting it together, I had a few friends that like, you got to space out these villanelles a little bit. They were like, if you have too many of those, and together it felt very dense in those sections, which I mean, they're still not very long poems, but so yeah, then I'm kind of thinking about pairs of poems and kind of thinking which poems are talking to each other, and then which poems are those pairs talking to each other. And then I'm kind of, at least for me, like the epigraph quotes or things that I thought about later, like after I put the book together. And then I'm thinking, who are these people that I happen to be like reading at the same time that I was writing these poems? So I don't know, it takes me a while to figure out what is this thing about. It's very different for me than when I'm writing nonfiction and essays, where I kind of have like, there's this thing that I'm kind of like thinking about and talking about with the poem.
Yeah.
It's very different.
How often when you do the laying out on the table and you start shuffling, how many times do you reshuffle? I mean, is a lot of that going on, or?
A bunch of times. Plus, like I would also change up the book to some degree after, say I sent it to a contest, I have it in that form. And then I might be like, there's another contest, and let me tinker around a little bit. So definitely multiple times. I also tried different things because I wanted to kind of see like length, but also like just having them all out together. Sometimes I would put some up on the wall so I could see them that way. Yeah. So yeah, and then it might have been a matter of, oh, I really like this poem, but it's really not going to fit. Or I also like small books of poems. And so I'm like, let me just take that one out. It's okay, but it didn't feel like that strong of a poem. So that's part of the process too, was kind of weeding out poems that maybe just like weren't quite working in the context of the book.
Right. Today I was talking about my screenwriting class. We were talking about log lines, right? It's this one line that just says, this is what my movie is about. What would be the log line of this book? Somebody said, give me in one sentence what this book is about.
Yeah, it's a hard thing. It's a hard thing with poems, but I feel like I kind of had to do it when I was writing, like, what is the thing that's going to be there for the book? And so I would say it's about like secrecy and loss, and like what happens when this speaker like grows up queer in the South, but has this relationship that remains a secret. What kind of happens? What kind of losses happen because of that secrecy? That's kind of longer than a log line, but
that's good. That was good. That was a good log line. Listen, one of my favorite poems is the opening poem in the book. Would you like? Could you read that for us?
Yeah. So just a little bit of context about it. I started writing this poem because I found this quotation from the Century magazine from October 1891, and that's kind of the spark that led me to write the poem. So I'm going to read the epigraph first, and then I'll read the poem. It says, "The French, I believe, have agreed on the term aviation in case they ever succeed in flying." And so I like this idea of actually just coming up with a word for something and having language for it before you can actually do the thing. There's something about having, when you have the language for something, then kind of you make it happen. And so that's sort of connected when I was thinking about what did this mean for me? Like growing up, I didn't feel like I had the language. And for a long time, I didn't come out to like my mid-20s, to some people, like not to my late 20s. And so I really felt like I didn't have the language to talk about my own questions I had surrounding my own sexuality. So the title of the poem is "The Science of," and then there's a space. And so it kind of allows you to fill in what is this word going to be. So there's several places in the poem where you'll hear me pause, and that's where there's another space. It's allowing you as a reader to kind of put in whatever word you want. The science of. Let's agree on a word for "in case we ever succeed in." To the girls who lie down in fields, their bicycles on their sides, too, like horses asleep in the sun. Know this, even though is not a science yet, it will be. When you button your shirt in the morning, fingers fumbling to fasten the circles, to thread them through, know that we invented the word for this science from bud, as if a row of tender orchids will soon bloom down your chest, a new branch of botany. Science of radio, science of sleep, science of kindness, science of the wheel. One day we will study like we study flight or photography. Let's agree on this. Everything exists on a spectrum. Word derived from specter, science of startle, science of the remarkable. Two girls in a field test the science of buttons, their shirt soon to break into yellow blooms.
That's really wonderful. I love the fact that you begin the book with that, and you begin with these blank spaces that we as readers are supposed to fill in, and it kind of pulls you in. To me, it kind of pulls you into the book and kind of starts you on the journey through the book. Were there poems that did not make the cut for this, and why not? What was the criteria that you used, or is there a common criteria that you used to say this one doesn't work, this one doesn't make the cut?
Well, it's funny because sometimes I'll look back at ones I cut and I'm like, oh man, I missed that poem. Just should have put it in there. So a lot of times it would be like in the series poems, there was like, and there was at least two other Eros poems that just like, they weren't quite working. I can't even maybe pinpoint. It just felt like I couldn't quite ever get them right. And then it just, maybe at a certain point I would have gotten them right. Maybe I'll come back to them, but I just couldn't get them right in the timing that I was working on the book. I just always kind of, something about it bothered me, like when I would read back through the poem. And then what else? There was a couple of, there were some more poems that were like the thank you note poems. Like actually I had a thank you note to this dorm room that I lived in. I don't think that one ended up in here, which that actually was like an editor cut. He was just like, this one doesn't feel as strong as the other ones. And ultimately, I think he was right. I mean, there were some things in there that I was still trying to kind of figure out. And so then I actually kind of forget that sometimes that it's not in the book. Yeah, so there were ones that I think when I was talking with the press, they were like, this one just feels stronger and to me does the work of this other poem. This other poem kind of talks about the same thing. So, to me, it felt different, but Yeah, so that's always helpful to have someone who's a close reader and is figuring out, because I'm all for like cutting concision. I actually have a harder time kind of like expanding out onto something. It always like takes a different kind of headspace for me.
Um, could well, let me. I was going to ask you two different things, but let me start back with the villanelles. Do you think in villanelle? I mean, there are so many villanelles and they're wonderful, but that's a hard form. I mean, that's a hard form to master, and you seem to have this like really fluidity with the villanelles. Um, eh, um, is that the only form you're attracted to? Do you write in a lot of forms, or are you sort of like, that's my thing? I love to do villanelles.
Yeah, so I remember when I first started, I was doing a like poem exchange with a friend of mine, and we were actually going through a bunch of different forms, and like I would write one and she would write one, and we kind of respond in some way to each other, like whatever kind of, maybe a line or an image or something, back and forth. And I remember when we got to the villanelle, something about it, yeah, I just really like loved the form. And then I was like, I had memorized for a class like Elizabeth Bishop's One Art, and just like something about the rhythms of the repetition. I liked how she was playing with the repetition, that we didn't get that line repeated fully every time she repeated it. And oftentimes, like, I'll just sometimes say that poem back to myself. And I think in part, you get kind of rhythms in your head. And I like the fact that in that form, you have the repetition, you're playing around with the language. There's something kind of like a puzzle about it to some degree. Like whenever I'm drafting those, it's kind of fun to look back at those pages, because I have a bunch of different words that could be possibilities for like, oh, this word here for the rhyme, can I, what am I going to have this repetition be? What is the new rhyme going to be? And then kind of going back, it's hard too, though, to revise those poems. So a lot of revision is happening like in my head while I'm writing out that. I don't know if it even counts like the first draft, but so much of those pages are just covered with all different types of words, or like, no, like I need to work on this. But it was harder for me to revise those. But I think too with this book, something that I've thought about is the way in which the form kind of resists this linear narrative of, A, B, C, you're going through like kind of moving forward, it's just like constantly going back. And I think, for myself, which was like trying to figure out things from my past, it became really important for me to kind of go back and be able to go back and not feel like, oh, someone's saying, oh, you need to like just move forward from this. I actually needed to kind of like investigate some of these things from the past. So it's a form that like kind of mimics that to me.
Oh, that's cool. Yeah. Would you pick one of the villanelles, if you can read it for us, if you would?
Yeah. I'll read. So I wrote this series. These are they're all titled Antlery. And this is the second one in the series. But basically what happened with these is I would start writing one, and then I wouldn't be able to fully talk about what I wanted to talk about with it in just the one villanelle. So yeah, this is called Antlery. Our want grew, and it makes sense that it grew from our heads. Sex is mostly mental, you said. But really, I sensed we were out of our heads, off balance, out of line, the cost of loving secretly. We tricked ourselves, foolish innocence, into thinking we could want without consequence. If I compare desire with deer, quietly through snow at night, finding the scent of every buried thing, in its defense, I'm always defending desire. Maybe it's what we needed to get through. I sense this is the very logic of want. The sequence of events that got us here arguably follows this thought. You came to my senses. Put another way, I couldn't make sense of myself until you showed up. You and me, two girls in the South, didn't make sense. Fear made us biblical, animal, unsensed.
That's gorgeous. I always like it when you read one, and I've got a line underlined that I love that parenthetical in there. I'm always defending desire. That's a great line. The antlery, it threw me because I was reading these poems and I put the book down. I read one named Antlery, and then I picked it back up and flipped open. And I said, "Oh, that's where I left off," and it was another one named Antlery. So, but one thing I wanted to ask you about is this: there's some really great transitions between the poems. Like you've got, oh gosh, I've got the poem Bullfrog Drawl. You that poem finishes, and the next line, the opening line of the next poem is about a frog. Then you got shed, and one of the definitions for shed, it's a more like a dictionary etymology poem, is, you know, obviously deer or antlered animals losing their antlers, and then you go into antlery. I mean, was that conscious? Was that on purpose to have those sort of transitions?
So, some of them are. I think that the one with the bullfrog drawl to the arrows, I think that I was thinking about the frog as the kind of pairing, that it's not necessarily like, I mean, they're different kinds of things. And so it's more paired, like, I saw them kind of paired them because of that image. The shed one, yeah, I thought in terms of, because that's like the second half of the book. And so, putting like the antlery poems with the shed, because shed was one I wrote later because I had written pine, which is also like a dictionary kind of entry one, because I was thinking a lot about the original title for the book was actually, I had a bunch of different titles, but one of them was like a kind of flight, I think, from the Eris's oxygen mask. And yeah, kind of flight. And so then when I named it pine, I was just thinking about all the ways in which this word kind of operated for me, like personally, like with my hometown and like the pine tree, and then also just with like wanting something, longing for it. And then it was like the more I thought about the word, there were these other kinds of meanings that kind of came up that added to what I was talking about. So with shed, that was more, I was thinking about echoes in the book, and I thought, let me try to write a poem that's also this, because I think I had found that definition of shed meaning to like to put out a fire, that was like, that's something interesting. So sometimes like a part of a word will lead me to writing a poem in some of these cases.
Could you read, I know you were mentioning that the dictionary poems sometimes are difficult to read, as far as opposed to seeing them on the page, but could you read shed?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so the way it works is like there's all these different definitions. So in the pine one, I actually take the definitions, the sentences. So in a dictionary entry, right, you'd have the definition and then they use it in a sentence. And so I took all these phrases from other sources for pine. But then for shed, I wrote the sentences for these ones. Shed. 1. An antler that's fallen off the head of a deer, elk, or moose. Searching for a shed in the woods is a study in loss. 2. To take off one's clothes. We shed our clothes all over your floor. 3. To lose. Hair, leaves, feathers, skin, naturally. I shed my hair all over your bathroom floor. 4. To spill. We shed our clothes like milk on your floor. 5. Of tears or blood. Hot were the tears Achilles shed for Patroclus. 6. Archaic. Of a river to overflow its banks. A river can shed itself into the sea, but then it is impossible to separate the river from the sea. Sea, watershed. 1, a drainage basin. 2, a point of transition between two conditions. Define the watershed between friendship and desire. 7, a structure built for shelter. We kiss secretly in the shed in your parents' backyard. 8, a hiding place. Can we live inside a poem, the line, a floorboard, metaphor, a nail, the page, a shed? 9, a fragment. This poem is only part of the story, a shed of the story. 10, to resist being affected by. Know that we invented shed from shade, as if to draw the blinds in a room. 11, to cleave, to divide something with a knife. When dissecting a heart, shed delicately. 12, archaic, to put out a fire. Our bodies are fire we cannot shed.
Yeah, that works well out loud. I love it. And if for those of you who don't have the book in front of you, it's wonderful on the page as well with the actual definition and italicized sentence you put after it. Let me ask you a question. The effect of the South on this book, would this book be what it is somewhere else? Have you thought about what effect just the geography of it? And I ask that because for a number of reasons, but then you've got the idea of pine, one of the definitions of pine being the trees, and you mentioned those, which are a southern staple. As I was reading this, I was wondering the effect of the South on this.
Yeah, I don't think that it would be, I think it would be a very different book if I hadn't grown up in the South, hadn't spent much of my life in the South. I think, these images sometimes that would just be coming to me that I was thinking of it for these poems, like, I think that's just part of, at least for me, when I'm in a place and a place is so much a part of me, like, those are a lot of times like the images that are going to come to me as far as like associative like leaps that I might be making. And I also think too, just like the cadences of like language, in South Carolina. I think that, like where you're from, the certain rhythms of the line, the slow, like certain slowness of things. I think that, I spent a lot of time like as a kid just like roaming around like in the parks and like and so I think that that was part of the other part is, of course, I mean I've thought a lot about this, like, because like my partner and like other people I know that grew up in other places that like were not the South. I think I always had this idea that, oh, the reason like I didn't come out until later was because I didn't know a single like queer person at all like at my high school, and we had like 900 people in my graduating class. I mean, it was a big high school. But that's been the same for other friends of mine and for my partner who grew up, in California and San Diego, that they're just, we're like it's just very different. Now, when I was teaching at Clemson a couple years ago, I was just like kind of in shock about like the students, like the way in which they were talking openly about their sexuality. I like zoomed into a class and this, student was like, oh, like, how do you feel comfortable talking about it? I was like, you're already talking about it like on the Zoom right now. Like I would have never been able to do that, like, as like a 19-year-old. So I just think that a lot of things have shifted, but I think that like those kinds of tensions were a major part of the book. I remember we talked about this a lot, Scott, and like fiction classes with you was like, what is the tension? Like what's in here? And I think that's true of poems too. Even if you're writing a very like hopeful poem, there's like a tension there that's part of that. And so a lot of the tension in the book comes from the fact of growing up where I did and like having this relationship was very much a secret. And that was also connected with like religion, which I also think was tied in ways to landscape too.
Let me mention, and I already mentioned The Rib Joint, which is a memoir and essays that you published back in 2017 or 2018, maybe. I don't know if it came
19,
out.
yeah.
Yeah, it won the 2017 prize, but came out then. And I noticed some echoes from The Rib Joint in Pine. And I asked you about it earlier, and you said that you were kind of juggling between the two projects. Talk to me a little bit about how one fed the other, perhaps.
Yeah, so I took a class at I went to University of Cincinnati for my PhD, and I took a class with Danielle Doolin, who writes both poetry and nonfiction. And so I took a class with her my first year in the program, and just like loved the genre, loved the way that she was kind of, talking about lyric essay, and like, oh, well, I'm just writing this essay, and so much of it is about sound. And yeah, so I took that class with her, and I was starting to write some of the essays that are in the Rib Joint from that class, and then continued working on that. Didn't really know that it was going to be like a book or a project until after I'd written many of the essays, and kind of thought about them. Maybe that's similar, I guess, in some ways. Now I'm working on a different book project. I'm already kind of thinking about thematic things, but yeah, so initially I didn't know exactly what it was going to be, but I think there were just like similar tensions that I was in both books that I was trying to figure out. But, in a poem, you've just like, it's such a small space. And in some ways, I really love the fact that you just have this small space, and for the villanelle, you have this sort of, here's the form, and you're not going to be writing this huge thing. And so, it didn't, but I still felt like there's things I wanted to say about the material that, because a lot of these poems in this book are like autobiographical, but I just didn't feel like I had enough room to talk about all the things that I wanted to talk about. And so in the essay, it was like different, the way I was processing those kinds of things too. But then thinking about what is the narrative like arc of the whole book, what is this happening in individual essays. So like I have a poem in here talking about Sally Ride, and I've like in the first essay in the Rib Joint, the main kind of thing that sparks it is me thinking about how Sally Ride didn't come out until she, in her obituary, like publicly didn't come out. And so I was just kind of thinking about that, and she was like a hero of mine as a kid. And so, but in the poem, like it's about that, but it's very different. Like I bring in, there is some, like, I guess in the speaker about like my own experience, but a lot of it there's different things that I explore in the essay than in, the poem. But I think that working on those projects, they overlapped when I was working on them. That I'm sure, like, the material was like in my mind. And then I would think about something and be like that, but I don't really start writing something and then realize this is an essay. I kind of am like, I don't know why that is, but I start writing it either as an essay or as a poem. And maybe I get an idea from one or the other, like, oh, I don't really get to talk about this that much, and this is something I have more to talk about, and then go from there. But yeah, so it's connected, but it feels like also different whenever I'm writing in different genres. So,
but they do kind of cross-pollinate each other sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
Listen, one of my favorite poems in the book is the last poem, which is sort of a villanelle plus kind of. But I love some of the word choices here, which I got to admit, I had to go to the dictionary and look some of them up. And maybe if you would read that, maybe some of the folks can hear some of those words. But anyway, would you read Vernal Equinox?
Yeah. Vernal Equinox. Talk is small and laundry hangs on string across the kitchen. Morning light like wool dyes your hair and our walls with its rising. You hum threads of songs while ironing a shirt. Forgiveness had been thin, a camisole. The back doors held open with string, so our orange cat can spend the morning on the stoop. I crack 4 eggs on a bowl's thin rim, the yolks intact, each rising like a brass button in the glare. Then you're mending a tear in my jeans and one in the shoulder of your favorite shirt. Imagine heat as string. With steam, you fix my chiffon dress, threading water through each wrinkle. Like 1,000 pressed stoles, the sky is clean, new cloth taut and rising. Breakfast almost ready, the eggs sizzling in the pan. The sun is just a pinhole, the wind a needle closing up a seam. Clouds rising and so threadbare, I can hear the snapping strings.
Yeah, I had to look up Wold, and then glare with Glair, which that's egg white, right?
Yeah, it's funny when my mom read that poem the first time, she's like, "You've misspelled a word in here," because she thought it was like glare, like like in your eye or something. I was like, no, like that's what it is, is that.
I never heard that word before. It's like, and I never heard of Wold, WOALD, which is it's like I've written down yellow dye or yellow color, something like that. Yeah.
This is what happens like with villanelles, they lead you to words, because I didn't know like some of these words before. I think that glare, I went looking for because of writing this particular poem. And so, yeah.
Is there a go-to poem in here that you haven't read that you tend to do at readings that you'd like to share with us?
Yeah. So, I'll read. This is a villanelle, another villanelle, surprise, for Jodie Foster. So she came out publicly at the 2013 Golden Globes. And I don't know if any of you saw that particular speech that she made, but it was like simultaneously, I was just like kind of moved by it, but also was like uncomfortable, like watching there's this tension, I don't know, on the stage. And I was just thinking about these lines between like privacy, I think particularly as her, being like a public figure that she is, and being someone that's famous, and also the time in which it was very different than it is now. But so this line of like privacy and like, is it partially like fear or shame? Like, what are these reasons like that you're not coming out, or that you choose to come out? The other reference in this poem is that she was in the 1997 film Contact, which I loved. And she plays a character called Ellie Arroway. So I mentioned her in the poem. A villanelle for Jodie Foster. In Contact, you wait for sound. Radio static in deep space keeps you awake long into the night. How small this globe, Ellie Arroway thinks. Minuscule, close to insignificant. It'll likely take lifetimes to hear the farthest star, radio frequencies scientists debate. History's slow, the way some satellites in space appear to stand still, orbiting the globe. Small moves, your father's canto. They should have sent a poet, you say, witness to another galaxy. Without radio proof, no one believes what you saw. No future, they say, is quite so opaque. When you come out at the Golden Globes, your silver dress glittering, all the stars aglow in the audience, you speak about privacy, but also wish, in your own brave voice, a radio wave, to be not so very lonely on this globe.
Have you heard from Jodie Foster about this?
I haven't. Yeah, my editor sent me like an email that was like, fingers crossed. I guess he like found her address or something, like, and tried to send it to her.
Yeah. Before we turn it over and ask, see if anybody else has some questions, I just want to say again, like this, I as a fiction writer and a nonfiction writer, I love to read poems, and I love to see what poets do with language. And this is a beautifully written book. The language in here is so rich. All the poems are so rich. It makes me jealous, some of the sounds and some of the rhythms in there. And also, please, if you haven't, check out the rib joint. It's and the cover art is done by somebody, an amateur artist named Julia, right? So it's gorgeous.
Thank you, Scott.
You're welcome. And if you haven't got these books, you can get them from Hub City. They'll be glad to take care of that for you. But Jackie, I don't know if I haven't been watching the chat or anything. Are there some questions?
Not any questions so far. I did open it up for just letting them know that they were welcome to ask any questions. We haven't had anyone pop in yet. I think they're just enjoying the conversation. This has been really great, you guys.
Well, we got plenty to talk about.
Go ahead.
I see my old roommate from college at Wofford is online, and I don't know if he's heard this much poetry in the last 40 years. So but you'd like the shed poem, Stephen. It's about antlers and stuff. You got and anybody can jump in and ask a question, but tell me, you've got two sections of this book, potentiality and ephemera. Does one lead to the other, or should they be viewed standing separately by themselves?
Yeah, that's a good question. I feel like the reason I have like the first part first, it does sort of, to me, like you need to understand certain things about the main sort of relationship in the book before then getting to the ephemera section in terms of thinking about some of these things that I'm exploring. So yeah, I don't necessarily think of them as standing apart. I think that they're definitely like talking to each other, but when I put the sections together, again, part of it was a balance of like which poems were talking, individual poems I saw as kind of talking to each other, or might work well that it felt like an echo coming off of another poem. But yeah, I definitely see it maybe as another kind of pause, the section break in there. I mean, I know people that have maybe like 4 sections in their book. And I didn't, because a part of me thought, well, do I put certain things together? Because I've seen people do sections where they have almost this kind of sequence like together in a short section or something, but I didn't really want to do that. I felt that having maybe, for instance, the Eros poems like in your head as you went through, then you come to another one and maybe hear it. So I didn't want those to be just like back to back. And I can't quite explain why. I just, it didn't feel like it would be as effective.
It works well. I have one more request, since I've been doing all requests tonight. My favorite phrase in the book is this, and it's this thing you poets do, is it says, for falling, the phrase begins, for falling asleep in that lawn chair at the end of my, and that's the end of a line, at the end of my, and the line breaks and it says girlhood. And I was not expecting the word girlhood at the end of that phrase. And that just kind of like made my mind explode. I love the line break there. And it's in a poem called Thank You Note to E.T.'s Eliot. And it's a beautiful poem. Would you read that one?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much for that. Yeah, I don't know why. I was so like kind of, I think maybe I had Sally Ride on my mind and then thinking about like space travel and ideas about time and thinking about imagining another space where, something else could have happened. I think I was like interested in that and thinking about it. Thank you note to E.T.'s Eliot. There are boys biking across the moon tonight. The forest is sure of it. I turn on the kitchen sink as hot as it will go. Steam cloaks the window. Thank you for waiting so late into the night, for falling asleep in that lawn chair at the end of my girlhood. For years, the glow of the tool shed was the only thing. Your brother and sister and mother and your dog are asleep inside, and your father is in Mexico. You taught me how to stand on a boy's back and kiss the prettiest girl I know, the floor covered in frogs. I leave a handful of Reese's Pieces in all the places she and I used to go. Yesterday's tavern, the concrete slab porch of my first apartment, the flimsy futon from my college dorm room. At the grocery store checkout in our old neighborhood, I drop a few orange pieces in the extra pennies dish. I toss a baseball through a doorway and expect it to come back. I buy a pot of dead flowers and wait for them to bloom. The tips of my fingers mimic the moon.
I love that point. I love that phrase in there. And that's Yesterday's in Columbia.
Yeah.
You know it's gone.
It is. No, that's sad.
They sold it and closed it down, and so yeah. I mean, I spent a lot of my graduate school time there. I know you maybe sounds like maybe you did too. So
yeah, it was definitely a place we went. Also would get food there. You know, and yeah, so then I was thinking about the name of it and going back. Yeah.
I have no more things to pick apart this collection. But I really, are there any, Jackie, if anybody wants to ask a question or?
There's not anybody right now. I did have a question though.
Go ahead.
I was wondering how long it took you, because you were working on two books, the collection and the essays at the same time. How long were you writing Pine specifically?
Yeah, so I mean, I was working on it probably for like 5 years. So you know, some of them shifted around. It's like some poems that I wrote like way earlier, and that's the other thing. It's hard about, right? This is true, I think, of prose too. You're writing a book, and if it takes longer, it's like you've changed, you know, as the writer so you know, that's sometimes hard to kind of figure that out, which there's maybe different voicing or something in places. So yeah, it took maybe about 5 years. And then I was like sending it out to contests, which took some time too, just getting it prepared and then sending it out. And and because I was working on both projects at the same time, but yeah, I didn't ever feel like stressed by them. It was mainly that like felt like they were talking to each other, or and I think when you're working on two different projects, sometimes like one project can be this really nice break from the other project. And because these were similar in terms of theme, but different in form, I could still be thinking about those ideas. But sometimes when I'm writing, for instance, a villanelle, like I kind of don't worry so much about what am I going to say next as much. Like sometimes I feel that way, like with nonfiction I'm writing, and I'm like, okay, like what is this other thing, or how is this research? Is it actually working here? You know, am I describing it well enough? Do I need this other scene? But sometimes in the villanelle, it's just like so much is about the language, the sounds, and the words. That I'm not as, I don't know, something in my mind. It's like kind of a nice pause that happens.
Thank you. I was also going to ask, you kind of touched on it, is one form or the other like easier, or I guess like more relaxing for you to write?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I don't know. I mean, sometimes, so I just got finished like last week. I was writing an essay that I've been working on for a couple of weeks, and had found a piece of research like last fall that I just kind of kept. I knew like I want to respond to this in some way. I just, with the pandemic and everything, I just could not, my mind could like not go into that space for a while. And so I was been working on it. Like there are these moments definitely whenever I will feel like relaxed and I'm in the project. But I definitely have to figure out ways to kind of recalibrate, like how else can I get into that material? You know, like if you just have it. So say I read this article and I read like a couple other articles about this one like news story. Then I'm thinking like, all right, can I tell like part of this story? Is it going to be interesting to people? like, does it connect enough to this own like personal narrative I'm kind of weaving in? And so I had to kind of like recalibrate, like writing out little things, you know, all right, this is a scene, like, and this is like part of this research, and then kind of like breaking it down, like what is it about this research? Why was I pulled in? And a lot of times that's like reading other people's work that will make me feel like, why am I interested in this? And then it kind of makes me realize, like, yes, I need to make sure that in this first part, like I'm like kind of setting up what are the central tensions of the piece, and I'm making this clear. So it's like part of going back. Sometimes like I'm reminded of those kinds of core things as I'm reading other people's work. So yeah, it can be relaxing, but also definitely like sit down, like making yourself sit down and actually do the work of it. So
Thank you.
thank you for that question.
Sure. We have another question from George. He said, I thought this essay, The Rib Joint, was wonderful and brave. Way to go, Julia. Also, what's your hometown, and is there any response from your fellow denizens?
Hi, George. Yeah, thank you so much, first of all, about that, about the rib joint. So I'm from Somerville, South Carolina, which I'm actually here in Somerville right now. I'm visiting my parents. We were on our spring break right now. Yeah, so I did a reading that was like a house reading at like a family friend's house. And I was like pretty anxious about it because I didn't know exactly like, oh, who's going to be there. It felt different than like when I read at like Cincinnati or other bookstores. I don't know, just being in my hometown. And I just felt anxious about people that were in the book, like what would they think? But like funny things happen. Like this guy who like we live around the corner from each other, and as I'm like signing his book, he's like, I mean, I was kind of hoping like I would be in the book somewhere, you know. And I was just like, oh, okay. So it made me feel better, because I was just anxious that people were gonna be like, I can't believe that you included this about me in here. Whereas I was just anxious, like anytime I was writing about someone, I was like, oh God, like, you know, what are they going to say about this? And so I really like, I thought like, why couldn't I be in the book? You know, I really thought maybe might be in here. So, yeah, it actually turned out to be this really great reading where these people that were like family friends, a lot of them like my parents' age, who after the reading they were like talking, you know, and it was just like a very different kind of feel because they were like saying these personal stories, you know, and like, oh, I remember this and I didn't know this. And because like also I'm like a very private person, and so I think a lot of them were just surprised, like, oh, you never talked about this, you know. And I just feel like very different when I'm working on my writing. It feels like I'm thinking about an audience, but I'm also at the same time like not thinking about them as much. And so it's kind of a different experience there. But yeah, thanks so much, George, for that question.
Thanks, Julia. I think that's all of the questions we have so far. Is there anything you and Scott want to wrap it up with?
Well, I want to say before I let Julia have the last word, is that you were talking about how long it took to write the book and write Pine, and I feel like this is when I read a book like this, you say it may have taken you this many years to write the poems or whatever, but I feel like you've been working on this book since you were a little girl, and it's just been percolating up there, and it's time for those poems to come out. So I really appreciate it, and finally, just when you buy these books of Julia's, buy them from an independent bookstore, Hub City, and if you don't buy them from Hub City, buy them from an indie bookstore, because man, right now indies, they need us more than ever. So support indie bookstores. And thank you, Julia. It was great to see you again and talk to you.
Yeah, you too, Scott. Thank you so much for your thoughtful questions, and thank you, Jackie, again for hosting the event. It's really nice to see some familiar faces on here. Hi, Nishima. So anyways, yeah, I hope you all have a great night. Thanks for tuning in and joining us.
Sure. Thank you both. Thank you, Scott, and thank you, Julia, for sharing your work with us. And we had a really great time talking with you, and wishing you all success in the rest of your future books, etc.
Thank you.
All right.
Bye,
Have a good
everyone.
night, everyone.
Good night.